Sera had not slept in 3 days. She sat at the entrance of the cave, her dark wings folded tight against her sides, listening to the sound of her mother breathing. Each breath came slow. Each breath came shallow. And between each one, there was a pause long enough to make Sera's chest tighten with fear. Vorna had always been the strongest dragon Sera knew. She was not the largest in the valley, and she had never been the loudest. But she had a kind of stillness about her that made other dragons feel safe. She was the one others came to when they were hurt or lost or afraid. She was the one who always knew what to do. Now she was lying on her side in the back of the cave, and her scales had turned the color of old ash. It had started small. A few pale patches near her shoulders. A little less fire when she breathed. Sera had told herself it was nothing. Dragons got tired. Dragons had slow seasons. But the pale patches had spread. They moved across Vorna's back and down her sides like frost creeping across stone. Her eyes, which had always been a warm amber, had gone dull and glassy. Sera had gone to the elder dragons first. Old Marin lived 2 ridges over, in a cave that smelled of pine smoke and dried herbs. She had looked at Vorna for a long time without speaking. Then she had shaken her head and said that she did not recognize the sickness. She had never seen scales go pale like that. She had given Sera a bundle of dried root to brew into steam and told her to keep Vorna warm. The steam had done nothing. Sera had then gone to Crest, the largest dragon in the valley. Crest had not even come to look. He had stood at the top of his ridge and called down that there was nothing to be done for a dragon whose fire was fading. He said it was the natural end of things. He said Sera should accept it. Sera had flown home without answering him. She was not going to accept it. That evening she sat at the cave entrance and looked out at the forest below. The trees were thick and dark green, and beyond them, where the land flattened out, she could see the faint glow of lights. Human lights. Small and pale yellow, dotting the edge of the settlement like fallen stars. She had never gone near the human settlement. None of the valley dragons did. It was not that they were afraid, exactly. It was more that the 2 worlds had simply stayed apart for as long as anyone could remember. Dragons stayed in the hills. Humans stayed in the flat lands. That was the way of things. But Sera found herself staring at those lights for a long time. She had heard things about humans. That they were strange and small and endlessly curious. That they could not breathe fire or fly or lift a boulder with their claws. But she had also heard that they could fix things. That was the word the younger dragons used sometimes, when they talked about the human settlement. They fix things. They take something broken and they find a way. Sera looked back into the cave at her mother. Vorna's side rose. Fell. Rose again. Sera made her decision. She went inside and pressed her nose gently against her mother's neck. Vorna stirred, just barely. Her eyes opened a little. I am going to find help, Sera said quietly. I will be back before morning. Vorna made a low sound. It might have been a question. It might have been a warning. But her eyes fell closed again before she could say anything more. Sera stepped out of the cave and spread her wings. The night air was cold and sharp. She dropped down from the ridge in silence, gliding low over the treetops, keeping her wings still so she would not make noise. The forest was dark beneath her. Somewhere below, an owl called once and then went quiet. She landed at the edge of the trees, just where the grass began to thin and the ground turned hard and flat. From here she could see the settlement more clearly. There were buildings made of wood and stone, with warm light coming through their small windows. There were tools and machines sitting in yards. There were pathways between the buildings, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and stopped. Sera had never been this close before. She moved carefully between two buildings, keeping low, trying not to let her claws scrape the ground. The settlement was quiet at this hour. Most of the lights were out. But at the far end of a wide dirt path, one building had its doors open and a yellow light burning inside. She could hear the sound of something metal being tapped. Slow and steady. Someone was still working. She stopped at the edge of the yard in front of that building and looked in. There was a human inside. An older man, with gray at his temples and oil on his hands. He was bent over something on a long wooden table, tapping at it with a small metal tool. He had a calm face. The kind of face that did not look like it panicked easily. He looked up. For a moment neither of them moved. Sera had expected him to shout. She had expected him to run for a weapon, or at least to back away. She had made herself as small as she could, which was still very large by any human measure, and she waited. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he set his tool down on the table. He wiped his hands on a cloth hanging from his belt. He walked to the open door of his yard and stood there, looking up at her. "You are a long way from the hills," he said. His voice was even. Not afraid. Not excited. Just calm and plain, the way someone speaks when they are simply saying what is true. Sera did not know how to begin. She had thought about this on the flight over. She had planned words. But now, standing here in front of this small, gray-haired man with oil on his hands, all the words she had prepared felt too big and too clumsy. So she said the only thing that was real. "My mother is sick. The other dragons cannot help her. I did not know where else to go." The man looked at her for another moment. His eyes moved over her carefully, the way someone looks at a problem they are already trying to understand. Then he nodded once. "Tell me what is wrong with her," he said. "Start from the beginning." Sera felt something loosen in her chest. It was not hope exactly. It was something smaller than hope and more honest. It was the feeling of not being alone in a problem anymore. She began to talk. And the man, whose name she did not yet know, stood in the doorway of his little yard and listened to every word. The man's name was Roy. He told her that himself, after she had finished explaining everything. He said it simply, the way people say things they have said 1,000 times before. Just Roy. No title. No long name. Just Roy. He had asked her clear questions while she talked. Not panicked questions, not the kind people ask when they are frightened and grasping for something to hold on to. Calm questions. Practical ones. How long had the pale patches been spreading? Was Vorna eating? Was she drinking water? Was the pale color only on the scales or had it gone into the skin beneath them? Sera had answered everything as carefully as she could. When she was done, Roy had nodded slowly and looked down at the ground for a moment, thinking. Then he had looked back up at her and said, "I need to see her." Sera had not expected that. She had expected him to say it was too far, or too dangerous, or that he was just a mechanic and what did she think he could do. She had expected some version of no wrapped in polite words. That was what she had been preparing herself for on the walk over to his yard. But he had simply said he needed to see her. "She is on the ridge," Sera said. "It is a long way." "How long?" "If I carry you, less than an hour." Roy looked at her for a moment. Then he went back inside his shop and began putting things into a large canvas bag. Sera watched through the open door. He took cloth rolls and metal tools and small glass bottles and a thick folded blanket. He moved without rushing but also without wasting time. He knew where everything was. He did not have to search for anything. He came back out with the bag over his shoulder. "All right," he said. "Let us go." Sera lowered herself carefully so he could climb onto her back. She felt him settle between her shoulder blades, one hand gripping the ridge of a scale. He did not say anything dramatic. He did not make a sound of amazement or fear. He simply held on. She rose into the night air and turned toward the hills. The flight was quiet. The forest passed beneath them, dark and still. The cold wind moved across Sera's wings in long steady sweeps. Behind her she could feel Roy holding firm, not rigid with fear but simply balanced, the way someone sits who has decided to trust the thing they are riding. She landed at the mouth of the cave as gently as she could. Roy slid down from her back and stood for a moment, adjusting to the ground. Then he looked into the cave. Sera watched his face. Vorna was worse than she had been 2 hours ago. That was the first thing Sera noticed when she stepped inside. Her mother had shifted in her sleep, and now she was half curled on her side, her great head resting on the stone floor. Her breathing was louder now, and slower. The pale color had crept further down her neck. Roy walked into the cave without hesitating. He set his bag down a few feet from Vorna and crouched beside it, taking out a small lantern and lighting it. The warm light spread across the cave walls. Vorna stirred at the light but did not wake fully. Her eyes opened a little, unfocused, then closed again. Roy began examining her. He moved slowly and carefully, which Sera was grateful for. He did not touch anything without looking first. He studied the pale patches on Vorna's scales, leaning close, holding the lantern up. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the edge of one pale patch and held them there. He moved along her side, checking different spots. He looked at her claws, at the thin skin along the edges of her folded wings, at the line of her jaw. Sera stood back and watched. She wanted to tell him to be careful. She wanted to say something. But she kept quiet because she could see that he was concentrating, and she did not want to break whatever process was happening in his mind. After a long while Roy sat back on his heels and looked at the base of Vorna's wings. He leaned in again, closer this time. He pressed carefully along the joint where the wing met the body. His fingers moved slowly, feeling along the ridge of bone beneath the scales. He stopped. He pressed again, more gently this time. Then he sat back and looked at Sera. "There is something hardened here," he said, pointing to the joint area. "Right where the wing connects. It feels like it has locked up. Like a joint that has calcified." He paused. "Do you know what that means?" "It has gone stiff and solid," Sera said. "Yes. And I think it is pressing against something it should not be pressing against. It may be cutting off the flow of warmth through her body. That could explain the pale color. The cold patches. The weak breathing." Sera stared at him. "You found that by touch?" "I fix machines," Roy said simply. "A blockage is a blockage. The material is different. The idea is the same." He did not say it like he was proud of himself. He said it the way someone explains a fact. Just the plain truth of how his mind worked. Sera looked at her mother. Then back at Roy. "Can you fix it?" she asked. Roy was quiet for a moment. He looked at the joint again. He looked at the tools in his bag. He looked at Vorna's face, still and pale in the lantern light. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "But I am going to try." Those 5 words landed in Sera's chest like something solid. She had not realized how much she needed to hear them until they were already said. Not a promise. Not a guarantee. Just a quiet, honest statement from a man who was already opening his bag and getting to work. She watched him take out the cloth rolls and begin warming them near the lantern. She watched him select a tool with a smooth rounded end, made for pressing and easing rather than cutting. She watched him move back to Vorna's side with steady hands and careful eyes. Vorna stirred again. This time her amber eyes opened and stayed open. She looked at Roy. Roy looked back at her. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Vorna made a low sound deep in her throat. Not a growl. Not a warning. Something quieter than that. Something that sounded almost like a question. I know, Roy said gently. I am going to be careful. Sera did not know if her mother understood his words. But Vorna's eyes stayed open and calm, watching him. And she did not pull away. Sera sat near the cave entrance, her wings folded, her eyes on Roy's back as he began his slow and patient work. The lantern cast long warm shadows across the stone walls. She still did not fully trust him. But she was beginning to. Roy worked the way still water moves. Slow. Quiet. Steady. Without any wasted motion. He had laid out his tools on the flat cloth beside him in a neat row. There were smooth rounded pressing tools of different sizes, a few small flat paddles made of thick wood, and several strips of heavy cloth that he had folded into thick pads. He had also taken out 3 small glass bottles. One held a pale yellow oil that smelled faintly of pine. One held a dark paste that Sera did not recognize. The third held plain water. He did not rush to use any of them. First he just looked. He held the lantern close to the base of Vorna's left wing joint and studied it for a long time. His eyes moved in a slow and careful pattern, the way someone reads something important and does not want to miss a word. He tilted his head one way, then the other. He pressed 2 fingers gently into the thick skin around the joint and held the pressure there, counting something in his head. Sera watched from across the cave. She had told herself she would stay back and let him work. She had told herself she would be calm. But her tail kept moving behind her without her meaning it to, sweeping slowly back and forth across the stone floor the way it always did when she was anxious. Roy noticed. He did not look at her directly. But he spoke without turning around. She is not in pain right now, he said. Her breathing is steady. That is a good sign. Sera made herself be still. Roy uncapped the small bottle of pale yellow oil and poured a small amount onto his palms. He rubbed them together slowly, warming the oil between his hands. Then he placed both palms gently against the joint at the base of Vorna's wing and began to press. Not hard. Not sharp. Just a slow, firm, circular pressure that moved in patient repetition. Round and round. The same motion, over and over, like someone trying to loosen the lid of something that had been sealed shut for too long. Vorna made a low sound. Sera was on her feet in an instant. She is all right, Roy said, still not stopping. That sound is not pain. That is the feeling of something beginning to move that has not moved in a long time. It is uncomfortable. But it is not harmful. Sera stood for a moment, every muscle in her body tense. Then slowly she sat back down. She believed him. She was not sure why exactly. He had not given her any reason beyond his calm voice and his steady hands. But there was something about the way he worked that made panic feel out of place. Like bringing a storm into a room where someone was carefully building something small and precise. He worked the oil into the joint for a long time. Then he set the bottle aside and picked up one of the cloth pads. He carried it to the small lantern and held it close to the heat, not close enough to burn but close enough to warm it through. He checked it with the back of his hand the way someone checks a blanket for a child. When it was warm enough he folded it once more and carried it back to Vorna's side. He pressed the warm cloth pad firmly over the joint and held it there. Vorna exhaled. It was a long breath, longer than the ones before it. Her whole body seemed to settle a little, like something in her had unclenched just slightly. The warmth helped soften the calcified area, Roy said quietly, more to himself than to Sera. Like heating old metal before you try to bend it. You do not force it. You just give it the conditions it needs. Sera listened to every word. She found herself moving closer without deciding to. Just a few steps. Then a few more. Until she was close enough to see the detail of what Roy was doing. She could see his hands through the dim light, firm and unhurried. She could see the way he checked Vorna's breathing every few minutes, just a glance at her mother's side to make sure it was still rising and falling in the right rhythm. He replaced the cloth pad twice as it cooled. Each time he warmed a fresh one near the lantern with the same careful patience. After the third pad he set the cloth aside and picked up the smallest of the rounded pressing tools. It had a smooth ball-shaped end, polished from long use. He placed it against the joint and began working it in the same slow circular motion as before, but now with slightly more focus, pressing into a specific spot just below the surface ridge of bone. He found something. Sera could tell by the way his hand stopped for just a moment. Not in alarm. In recognition. The way a person pauses when they put their hand on exactly the thing they were looking for. There, he said softly. What is it? Sera asked. The blockage. The main point of it. He kept his tool exactly where it was, not pressing harder, just holding the position. It is about the size of my fist. Hardened. Sitting right against the channel where warmth moves through her body. He paused. It has probably been building for a long time. Months. Maybe longer. Sera felt something heavy settle in her chest. She thought about all the months she had watched her mother slow down. All the times Vorna had said she was just tired. All the mornings her fire had been a little weaker than the day before. All of it adding up quietly in the background while Sera had told herself it would pass. Will you be able to move it? She asked. Roy was quiet for a moment. His hands were still working, slow and steady. I cannot remove it, he said. I do not have what I would need for that, and even if I did, it would not be safe to try tonight. But I may be able to ease it. Shift it just enough to take the pressure off. Give her body room to start doing what it is supposed to do. And if that works, then her circulation starts to return. The pale color begins to fade. Her fire comes back slowly over time. He glanced back at Sera then. Just briefly. It will not be instant. But it will be real. Sera looked at her mother's face. Vorna's eyes were closed again, but her breathing had changed. It was still slow, but it had lost that strained, effortful quality it had carried for weeks. It sounded easier now. Like something had given way just a little. Roy turned back and kept working. The lantern burned low and warm. The cave was quiet except for the sound of Vorna breathing and the faint press of Roy's tools moving in their slow and careful rhythm. Sera sat beside her mother and watched the old mechanic work through the night. Fear was still there inside her. It had not gone. But beside it now, growing steadily in the warmth of the lantern light, was something that felt very much like wonder. It got worse before it got better. Sera had not expected that. She had watched Roy work with such careful patience through the first hours of the night that she had allowed herself to believe the worst was already behind them. That the slow steady work of his hands would simply keep moving in the right direction until morning came and her mother was well. But around the middle of the night Vorna's breathing changed. It did not stop. But it became uneven. A long breath, then two short ones, then a pause that lasted just a beat too long before the next one came. Sera was on her feet the moment she heard it. Her wings half opened without her thinking. Every part of her body went tight and alert. Roy was already moving. He had not been asleep. Sera realized then that he had not even tried to sleep. He had been sitting beside Vorna the whole time, his back against the cave wall, his tools within reach, his eyes open. Just waiting. Just watching. He pressed both palms flat against Vorna's side, feeling the rhythm of her breathing through his hands. He was still for a long moment. Then he moved to the joint again and began working with the warm cloth packs, heating them faster this time, pressing them firmly and replacing them quickly. His movements were the same as before, calm and unhurried, but there was a focus in them now that had not been there earlier. "Is she getting worse?" Sera asked. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "Her body is working," Roy said. "Sometimes things get harder before they ease. That is not always a bad sign. It can mean something is shifting." Sera stayed close. She lowered herself to the ground beside her mother and pressed her nose gently against Vorna's neck. She could feel the pulse there. Slow. Unsteady. But present. She stayed like that for a long time. Roy kept working beside her in silence. At some point the silence became comfortable rather than heavy. Sera was not sure when that happened. She only noticed it when she realized she had stopped counting the seconds between each of her mother's breaths and had simply started listening to them. She looked at Roy. He was warming another cloth pad near the lantern, his face quiet and concentrated. There were lines on his face that spoke of a long life and a lot of time spent in dim light doing careful work. His hands were rough and scarred across the knuckles, the hands of someone who had worked with hard materials for many years. But they moved with a gentleness around Vorna that Sera had not seen in any creature twice Roy's size. "You have done this a long time," Sera said. "Fixed things." Roy pressed the warm cloth back into place. "Most of my life," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who does not want to answer. The quiet of someone choosing the right words from among many. "I had a wife," he said. "Her name was May. She was sick for a long time before she passed. There was nothing I could do about it. Nothing anyone could do." He paused. "After she was gone I found that I needed to do something with my hands. Something that had a result at the end of it. Something that could be helped." He smoothed the edge of the cloth pad with his thumb. "Broken things can be helped. Not always fixed completely. But helped. That is usually enough." Sera looked at him for a long moment. She had come to the human settlement desperate and out of choices. She had not expected to find anything beyond a small chance at help. She had certainly not expected to find a person like this. A person who had been shaped by loss into something quiet and useful. A person who stayed. "I am sorry about May," Sera said. Roy nodded once. "Thank you," he said simply. They were quiet again after that. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Something had passed between them in those few words and the cave felt warmer for it. The night moved on. Roy did not stop. Every hour or so he would work the joint again with the pressing tool, slow and careful, never forcing anything. He had explained to Sera earlier that forcing a calcified blockage was the fastest way to cause damage. The only way to move it safely was patience. Heat and pressure and time, applied over and over until the hardened mass shifted on its own. Sera had thought about that for a long time after he said it. She thought about how her first instinct when Vorna had started getting sick had been to find a fast answer. A quick solution. Something that would fix everything immediately. And how every fast answer she had tried had done nothing. And how this man, with his old tools and his warm cloth packs and his slow circular hands, was doing more in one night than all of it combined. There was a lesson in that somewhere. She was not quite ready to put it into words yet. An hour before dawn Vorna shifted. Not in distress. She moved the way someone moves when they are coming up slowly from a very deep sleep. Her great head turned a little on the stone floor. One foreleg stretched out and then settled. And her breathing, which had been uneven for hours, found a new rhythm. Long, steady. Deep. Sera lifted her head and stared. Roy had gone still too. Both of them watched Vorna breathe for a long moment without speaking. Then Roy leaned forward and held the lantern close to the scales along Vorna's neck and shoulder. He moved it slowly, studying the surface. "Come and look," he said quietly. Sera moved close and looked where he was pointing. It was faint. So faint she almost missed it. But it was there. Along the ridge of Vorna's neck, where the scales had been the color of old ash for weeks, there was the faintest trace of color returning. Not the deep rich color of a healthy dragon. Nothing like that yet. Just a whisper of warmth beneath the pale surface. The way color returns to cold skin when it is finally brought near heat. Sera stared at it for a long time. She did not trust herself to speak. Roy set the lantern down and sat back. He rolled his shoulders slowly. For the first time all night he looked tired. Not defeated tired. Just the honest tiredness of a person who had given everything they had to a long and careful task. He looked at Vorna's face. Then he looked at Sera. "Her breathing is steady," he said. "The color is coming back. Slowly, but it is coming." He paused. "I think she is going to be all right." Sera felt something break open in her chest. Not in a painful way. In the way something breaks when it has been held closed by pressure for too long and the pressure is finally gone. She did not cry. Dragons do not cry. But she lowered her head and pressed it gently against Roy's shoulder, and she stayed there for a moment. Roy did not move. He did not make a sound. He just sat quietly in the early morning dark and let her. The sun came up slowly. It crept along the stone floor of the cave in a thin pale line, moving from the entrance inward, touching the walls and the tools and the folded cloth packs one by one. It reached Vorna's side and moved across her scales, and where it touched the color that had returned overnight, it caught and held like light on water. Sera saw it first. She had not slept either. She had stayed close to her mother through the last hours of darkness, listening to that steady breathing, watching the slow rise and fall of Vorna's side. Every breath had felt like a gift. She had stopped taking them for granted sometime around the middle of the night and she did not think she would start again for a long time. Roy was sitting against the cave wall with his legs stretched out in front of him and his eyes closed. He was not fully asleep. Sera could tell by the way he was sitting, still upright, still present. Just resting his eyes. Just giving his body a few minutes of stillness after the long night. Then Vorna moved. It was not the small restless shifting of a sick creature uncomfortable on hard stone. It was a deliberate movement. Purposeful. Vorna drew her foreleg in slowly and pressed it beneath her. Then the other one. She lifted her head from the floor with the careful steadiness of something that knows it is still weak but is choosing to rise anyway. Sera was beside her in an instant. "Slowly," she said. "You do not have to move yet." Vorna turned her head and looked at her daughter. Her amber eyes were clearer than they had been in weeks. Not fully bright yet. But present. Focused. The glassy dullness that had frightened Sera so badly was gone. Vorna looked at Sera for a long moment. Then she looked at Roy. Roy had opened his eyes at the sound of movement. He was sitting forward now, watching Vorna with quiet attention. He did not stand. He did not move toward her. He simply waited, the way he had waited through the whole long night, letting things happen at their own pace. Vorna studied him. She looked at him the way dragons look at things they are trying to understand completely. Not just the surface of a thing but the whole of it. Roy sat still under that look without flinching. He met her eyes steadily and said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that Sera began to wonder if she should say something to fill it. Then Vorna spoke. Her voice was rough from disuse and weak at the edges, but it was clear. "You stayed," she said. Roy nodded once. "Yes." "Through the whole night?" "Yes." Vorna was quiet again. Her eyes did not leave his face. She was still reading something in it, still working something out. "What do you want for it?" she asked. The question was not rude. It was genuine. Direct in the way that dragons are always direct, because dragons do not believe in asking sideways what they can ask plainly. She wanted to know what Roy expected in return. What the cost was. What she owed him for the night he had spent on the cold stone floor of her cave with his tools and his warm cloth packs and his patient hands. Roy looked at her for a moment. "Nothing," he said. Vorna's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in suspicion exactly. In something closer to confusion. "Nothing," she repeated. "Nothing," Roy said again. Calm and simple. The same way he said everything. Vorna looked at Sera. Sera gave a small nod, confirming what Roy had said. That he had asked for nothing on the flight up. That he had taken nothing during the night. That he had simply come and worked and stayed. Vorna turned back to Roy. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a bird outside the cave entrance started singing and then stopped again. Long enough for the line of sunlight on the floor to move a full hand's width further into the cave. When she finally spoke again, her voice was different. Lower. More careful. Like she was carrying something fragile in the words. In the dragon tongue, she said, "We have a word for someone who gives help when they are asked. We have a word for someone who gives help out of duty. We have a word for someone who gives help because they will be repaid." She paused. "We do not have a word for someone who gives help when they are owed nothing and asked for nothing and want nothing back." Roy listened without interrupting. "In all the years of our language," Vorna continued, "we never made that word. Because we did not think such a thing was common enough to need one." She looked at him steadily. "We were wrong." Roy said nothing. He did not look embarrassed exactly. But he looked like a man who was not entirely comfortable being looked at so directly. He dropped his eyes for just a moment and then brought them back up. "I just did what I could," he said. "Yes," Vorna said. "That is exactly what I mean." Sera watched her mother and the old mechanic look at each other across the cave floor, and she felt something in that moment that she could not name either. Something quiet and large. The feeling of witnessing a thing that does not happen often and knowing it while it is still happening. Roy began packing his tools not long after. He did it the same way he had laid them out, carefully and without rushing. Each tool wiped clean and placed back in the canvas bag. The empty bottles stoppered and wrapped in cloth. The remaining pads folded neatly. He worked through the whole of it without making it into anything more than what it was, a man tidying up after a job, ready to go home. Sera flew him back to his yard. The morning air was cool and bright, and the forest below was full of bird sounds and the smell of wet leaves. Roy sat between her shoulder blades the same way he had on the journey up, steady and quiet, one hand resting lightly on the ridge of a scale. When she landed at the edge of his yard, he slid down and stood for a moment adjusting to the ground. He looked up at her. "She will need rest," he said. "Weeks of it. And warmth. Keep the joint warm every day if you can." "I will," Sera said. Roy nodded. He picked up his bag and walked toward the open doors of his shop. At the threshold he stopped and looked back once. He did not say anything. He just nodded again. A small, plain nod. The kind that means everything has been said that needs to be said. Then he went inside. Sera stood at the gate of his yard for a moment. Then she spread her wings and rose into the morning sky and turned back toward the hills. The next morning Roy came out of his shop at first light the way he always did, canvas bag over one shoulder, cup of something warm in his hand. He walked to the gate of his yard and stopped. There was something resting against the post. He crouched down and looked at it without touching it for a moment. It was a dragon scale. large as both his hands placed flat together. It was not the pale gray color of Vorna's sickness. It was the color that had been coming back all through the long night. Deep and warm and alive. And in the early morning light it glowed softly gold. Roy looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up carefully with both hands and carried it inside. He set it on the shelf above his workbench, in the spot where there was always a little morning light. And he went back to work.